Rich parents ignored their bookish son for most of his existence and deprived him of even minimal resources, but now that his prosperous tech company is thriving, they are weeping foul play and pleading for his mercy. Hello, everyone. I'm using a one-off account because I don't want to crowd my primary profile. So, I'm a 27-year-old guy who launched my own enterprise with a couple of my college pals about a year ago. We've been doing remarkably well financially and are operating in the black at the moment. Not too long ago, I was stunned to receive a message from my long-estranged parents, who are both 54, and who have not reached out to me even once since I graduated. They announced that they wanted to join my company as partners since they had the capital and wished to invest. I promptly refused. I did not even stop to discuss it with my co-founders because everybody was well aware of how terrible my relationship was with my mother and father, and I couldn't bear the idea of having them in my business under any circumstances. My parents had always neglected me and ridiculed me as I grew up, which made no sense to me because, truth be told, I was precisely the type of child most parents would take pride in. They were reasonably well off financially. My father is a dental surgeon and my mother is the CFO at a firm, so I was raised in an environment that prioritized ambition and high achievements. Naturally, I developed big aspirations at a very young age, but for reasons that baffled me then, my parents were never genuinely supportive. Instead, they would taunt me for being a geek. Although they had money, they contributed next to nothing toward my most basic needs simply out of pure malice. For the longest time, I had no clue why they harbored such dislike for me, until I discovered they secretly blamed me for not being able to achieve the level of stardom they had long yearned for. Granted, they were fairly successful, but apparently, not as acclaimed as they believed they deserved to be. I gleaned this information during one of my vent sessions to my aunt, my father's younger sister who is now 46. She was the only one who ever showed me empathy when I was a teenager. She felt I was old enough by 16 to learn the hidden truth behind their odd hostility. They had never actually wanted a child but succumbed to family pressures to have me. As a result, they firmly held that the time, resources, and energy they wasted on raising me should have gone into propelling their respective careers forward, presumably leading to the prominence they thought they deserved. Sadly, being saddled with me incited them to deal with me in the harshest ways imaginable, like endlessly criticizing me to make me feel perpetually unworthy. I characterize my childhood as seriously underprivileged from an emotional standpoint. Even though they did pay for necessities like food and lodging, it was never coupled with genuine care. They offered no help with routine tasks like homework or projects, and definitely never stepped up to help me resolve conflicts at school. Anything I desired that was not strictly a necessity would get me laughed at or dismissed. To rub salt in the wound, they took repeated jabs at my appearance, an easy mark, since I was skinny and came off like an awkward computer enthusiast, and mocked my inclination toward all things tech. They joked that I'd amount to nothing more than some IT worker who merely troubleshoots computers for clueless office workers, so putting any money or time into me was a waste. This barrage of belittling continued throughout my childhood, messing with my emotions. At the time, I couldn't see how warped it was. In my naive view, if my parents didn't love me like other parents did, the fault must lie in me. Reflecting on it now, it was extremely messed up. Once I hit my teens, I began pushing back somewhat, but my father quickly shut it down with threats to leave me homeless if I didn't toe the line. So, I turned to my aunt and confided in her, which helped me cope a bit. She asked me countless times if she could report them, but I always said no out of dread of what the fallout might be. My aunt was not in a position to take me under her wing in an official capacity, and I feared becoming a burden to others. Ultimately, I chose to endure my parents' behavior at home. Whenever it felt unbearable, I just poured my heart out to my aunt, which offered temporary relief. Once I unearthed the root of my parents' demeanor, namely that they never wanted me and resented the time and money I cost them, I resolved that I would vanish from their lives as soon as my university days were done. They had made their lack of interest in me glaringly obvious by sending me to a subpar public school. I'm sorry if this sounds boastful, but it truly felt like an environment that didn't challenge my potential. It should have hinted how insignificant I was to them educationally or otherwise, yet there was still a tiny piece of me that harbored hope. That hope was extinguished when, after high school, just as I turned 18, they informed me I no longer had a place under their roof unless I somehow proved myself. On top of that, they refused to cover even a penny of my college tuition, despite having the financial means to do so. That was the final straw. I snapped and demanded that they couldn't treat me so cruelly, arguing that I had a promising future as a consistent straight-A student. If they kicked me out at this pivotal stage, right before college, it would threaten everything I'd worked so hard for. They remained unyielding, basically telling me to stop acting superior because, in their eyes, I was never going to go far. They insisted my teachers and friends had filled my head with delusions of genius and that being some so-called lowly IT guy would be the pinnacle of what I could aspire to. The hypocrisy of that statement was unbelievable, especially since many so-called lowly IT professionals are genuinely talented and deserving of respect. But my ignorant, awful parents would never see it that way. I tried to stand my ground, pushing them to at least fund my tuition if they wouldn't let me stay, but they refused. As a result, I packed up and escaped just a few weeks prior to my 18th birthday, seeking refuge at my aunt's place. During that time, I submitted scholarship applications to numerous colleges, while my aunt, kind soul that she was, still tried to make peace with my parents, though it was all in vain. Eventually, we decided that I would pick whichever institution offered me the largest tuition discount. Fortunately, one of the colleges granted me an 80% scholarship, and they also had an acceptable computer science department, so I was more than content. My aunt, who was in the sales field and modestly middle class back then, vowed to cover the remaining portion of my tuition. She didn't earn anywhere near what my parents did, but she was prepared to help me out however she could. My plan involved staying in the dorm as much as possible, only returning to my parents' home if it were absolutely unavoidable, and using my aunt's house as my fallback option whenever she was out of town for her job. Freed from my parents' oppressive household, my anxiety levels plummeted, and I found myself happier, able to form friendships far more easily than I used to. Among these new friends were individuals who eventually became my partners in launching an IT firm, a venture that's been fruitful so far. I assumed my parents wouldn't care about me, given they had never bothered when I was a child. But news travels, and when they heard I was graduating from college as the valedictorian, they decided to attend the commencement ceremony. They couldn't get in, though, because I didn't reserve tickets for them, nor did I invite them. We were essentially strangers at that point. Nonetheless, after the event wrapped up, I was stunned to see them there with my aunt, who looked equally irritated to be stuck with them. Apparently, my aunt had no choice but to endure their company during the ceremony. My plan was to hang out with my friends for celebratory drinks afterward, but instead, I ended up facing my parents in their hotel room for 2 hours, locked in a draining confrontation. They were enraged about being excluded from the ceremony while my aunt had been welcomed, and demanded an explanation. It was laughable to me since they had thrown me out at 18, refused to cover my college expenses despite having the means, and mistreated me to the brink of psychological torment for nearly my entire life. I felt they deserved no explanation at all. But I didn't want a dramatic scene on my college campus, so I accompanied them to their hotel. Once in the room, I erupted. I told them I was finished with them and had no desire for further contact. I threatened that if they tried to intrude in my life again, I'd take out a protection order or something along those lines. Storming off, I rejoined my friends, refusing to let them sabotage what should have been a joyous night for me. Later, my aunt filled me in that my parents were furious and planned to disinherit me. But since I never expected a dime from them, it did not bother me at all. For almost 7 years, I had no interaction with them. Then, out of the blue, a few days back, they reached out. Evidently, they badgered my aunt for my phone number under the pretext of wanting to make amends, and she passed it on, though she forgot to alert me in advance. She's swamped with work, so I can understand how it slipped her mind. But there was no apology when they spoke to me. Instead, they rushed straight to the topic of investing in my business now that it was on a profitable trajectory. Naturally, I said no, ended the call, and blocked them. I gave my friends a heads up, and they were perfectly fine that I had declined without conferring with them. They understood my deep-seated problems with my parents and respected that. After that, I wasn't sure what would happen next. Then it arrived. They retaliated by tagging me and my partners in a vitriolic post on Facebook, accusing me of not being the self-made tech genius I portrayed myself to be. They claimed I had relied on daddy's money from day one, and that my so-called success was exclusively the product of their generosity I was now denying. I was flabbergasted by their audacity. I nearly phoned them to demand they take it down, but then a thought clicked. I had a bit of hidden ammunition, some old videos I had shot back in my teenage years when I was still living with them. I had compiled daily recordings of the humiliation I endured, just in case I ever needed to prove how dreadful they were in court or any other legal situation. I had never once posted them because I cut them out of my life and wanted zero drama. But seeing their outrageous post changed the game entirely. I chose to upload those videos at last. And here is where I might have crossed into jerk territory. I did it through my public Instagram account, composing a thorough explanation of my family's dark history as the caption and attaching the videos that laid bare how my parents had tormented me, belittled me, and basically treated me as if I were a plague on humanity. I knew this could ignite a storm, but I felt it was justified after what they had pulled on Facebook. Right after posting, I reached out to my attorney, who had actually begun drafting defamation paperwork before I even finished explaining the events. She planned to contact my co-founders to confirm they were on board with the lawsuit since they, too, had been targeted in my parents' defamatory post. Indeed, several relatives and parental acquaintances had already commented in support of my parents, claiming they would never do business with us and that it was good I was being exposed. That clearly constituted grounds for defamation. I forwarded these screenshots to my lawyer, also letting my partners know so everyone stayed informed. Once that was sorted, I sat back, anticipating a desperate call from my parents asking for mercy. Instead, they called me from my aunt's phone a few days later, not to beg forgiveness, but to demand one from me. They accused me of messing up royally by uploading those videos in such a public arena, since their rant was on a private Facebook account limited to a smaller audience, whereas my Instagram account had a significant following. Unsurprisingly, people were already flooding them with hateful remarks, and some even issued threats. This backlash, they argued, could end up destroying both their careers since the videos portrayed them in an appalling light. If their employers discovered the posts, they would be thoroughly doomed. Feeling defensive, I responded that they had it coming, then cut the call. However, I did put my posts in the archive for a while and switched off my phone to decompress. A couple of hours later, I turned it on again to find an email from them. Within that email, they claimed they were regretful about the past but simultaneously denounced my reaction as reprehensible. They also insisted I had shared personal videos featuring them without their approval, which they presumed could be grounds for a countersuit. Obviously, it looked like they had been served with my defamation lawsuit and were now threatening to fight back by painting my actions as unscrupulous, which they argued might tarnish my enterprise's reputation. I consulted with my partners, and they unanimously agreed there was no valid reason to retreat from the lawsuit, given how openly they had spread falsehoods to wreck my credibility. They believed our side had followed the correct path, whereas my parents had lied out of spite and purely wanted to sabotage me. Logically, their stance was solid, but I couldn't help feeling conflicted. After all, they did say sorry in the email. Yet I also know a legal battle can be ugly for everyone. Part of me still wondered if I was overreacting. Am I the bad guy for pressing charges against my own parents for defamation, even though they offered me an apology through that email? Update 1. I made my choice to proceed with the lawsuit. In truth, it wasn't only my call, my partners were also involved since the defamation post directly referenced us all. Even if their initial Facebook rant didn't reach a vast audience, the very attempt to smear my name or my business is cause enough. Let's not forget, their motive was clearly to slander me for personal gratification, potentially wrecking my entire life's dedication to this company. Therefore, defamation seemed a fair solution. Also, their apology was hardly heartfelt, showing up only once they realized their own professional reputations were in jeopardy. That insincerity implies they weren't truly remorseful. My entire life, I've dealt gently with my parents because, on a subconscious level, I was terrified of them. Even as an adult pushing 30, I sometimes catch myself shuddering at the idea of confronting them, a leftover from years of being trained to fear my father's wrath. Reading a number of your comments snapped me out of it. I became aware of just how many times I could have unmasked their cruelty earlier but never did, solely out of terror. Well, not anymore. I'm finally in control, and they can't harm me now. I'm pursuing this lawsuit, no matter how many half-baked apologies they try to dole out. By doing so, I might get a well-deserved sense of vindication after enduring so much. I've played the role of the bigger person my whole life. There is absolutely no incentive for me to keep doing that for people who repeatedly target me. Their thirst for attention is disgusting, and I refuse to put up with it any further. Update 2. Today my aunt phoned me, asking what action I'd taken against my parents. I let her know that we were moving ahead with legal proceedings. She said she approved and that she was proud of me for sticking up for myself. She also expressed regret for not having done more when I was younger. I understand that she, too, had a career to build, and supporting a dependent in a more permanent capacity might have been overwhelming at the time. What mattered is that she did help me at pivotal moments, and I will always appreciate that. It's pointless to blame her. Meanwhile, my grandparents and the rest of the family absolutely idolized my parents, so none of them would have taken me seriously if I'd opened up about my troubled upbringing. Even if my aunt had gone to CPS, it's feasible I could have landed in foster care or, worst-case scenario, be subjected to even worse circumstances. She isn't perfect, but she remains the only relative who stood up for me in any manner. She was there for me enough that I cherish her for it. That is all. I haven't spoken to my parents since their email. Presumably, they are still waiting for me to retract the lawsuit, but it's been 4 days. Our current plan is to go through a court-assigned mediation process first. If a resolution isn't reached, we'll progress to trial. My parents have deep pockets, so I feel no qualms demanding that they atone for what they've done. None of this is my fault. They did this to themselves and should be held accountable. I have no concrete information about whether their employers have discovered their behavior, but they whined endlessly about how my videos jeopardized their jobs. Their texts and emails to me were dripping with manipulation tactics and blame games. I'm glad I didn't cave in this time, because that would have been disgracefully weak of me. Moreover, they tried to claim that my exposing the truth was somehow on the same level, or worse, than them spreading malicious lies. The difference is that I laid out factual evidence of their emotional abuse, while they unleashed baseless slander to undermine me. Frankly, a part of me is tempted to unarchive those videos once we're done mediating, since they really do deserve to be called out in front of everyone. Update 3, the court has designated a mediator for our discussions, and we were promptly notified. I briefly unblocked my parents so they could communicate logistics, but they ended up calling me just to demand that I withdraw the suit because things were escalating. I flatly told them that I had no intention of dropping it, and they lost their temper in a massive meltdown, yelling so fiercely that I couldn't even parse most of their words. I only caught that they were enraged and threatening me with random nonsense. I hung up. They called again, and then it was my father, barking at me that my petty antics wouldn't intimidate him. I fired back, unleashing all my pent-up anger, venting everything I'd been meaning to say for years. It felt deeply cathartic, though it was also quite intense. I slammed the phone down before he could respond. They then tried to corner my aunt and insisted I was suing them over trivial issues, hoping my aunt would pressure me to stand down. But my aunt, bless her, was beyond manipulation at this point. She told them she could offer them compassion if they wanted it, but that was the extent of her involvement, and if they harassed her any further, she'd report them to the authorities. I didn't get any more phone calls from them for a few hours. However, by evening, I discovered they had systematically reached out to each of our extended family members with the same sob story, accusing me of maliciously taking them to court. It was all orchestrated, as most relatives sent me a suspiciously identical text message, which was a dead giveaway that my parents had fed them a pre-written script. It's both pathetic and infuriating how far they'll go now that they realize they are cornered. Update 4, we are currently in the midst of the mediation. I'm on my lunch break and typing this in the hallway. My parents have been downright vicious during the negotiations, but it's apparent they're losing. They will have to concede to our conditions if they hope to prevent the case from heading to trial. When we paused for lunch, my father scowled at me as though he wanted to set me on fire with his eyes, while my mother adopted a melodramatic persona, acting like a wounded victim from a film. No one was buying it because it was transparent. It was all a theatrical display. My business associates, on the other hand, have been by my side the entire time, offering moral support, and it genuinely warms my heart. Just a short while ago, one of them reminded me that I could talk to him anytime, fully aware of how draining this experience must be for me emotionally. Despite having 2 toxic parents, I'm immeasurably grateful for the amazing friends and a truly caring aunt I have in my life. That is something I will never take for granted, now or in the future.